going to just kind of talk a little bit today with the assistance of our PowerPoint about some of the things that have happened in Ohio over the last several years. And I want you to feel that you could ask a question at any point you want to ask a question. If I talk about something that doesn't make sense or isn't clear to you, just raise your hand and let me know that, and I'll try to clarify at the time. It's hard to hold your questions, I think, to the end. If you're like me, I kind of forget them, or they're not nearly as interesting to me at the end as they would be if I had the opportunity to ask them when the question was in my mind. So, as I say, this is what I hope I can accomplish. I'm talk about some of the people that have been involved, some of the events that people have impacted in some way or another, and some of the opportunities and obstacles that counseling has faced as it's tried to become an important profession in Ohio. And I'll probably also deal, or will deal, with what I think is unique about what Ohio has done nationally, because I think that gets overlooked sometimes. We've made some contributions to the national scene, particularly in the area of clinical counseling, that were going against the tide, and I think have really changed the face of counseling across the country. And I'll be more specific about that as we go on. I'm not going to talk about rehabilitation counseling. That's not something I know a great deal about in terms of the history. I will talk a little bit about rehabilitation counseling around licensure and how we were able to avoid some of the conflicts that occurred in some states because we approached working with rehab counselors differently in a more collaborative way. I will talk a little bit about that. And I won't talk at all about drug and alcohol counseling, because that's another area that has its kind of its own separate history in this state. And I don't know enough about that separate history to give it the attention it deserves, so I won't be addressing that either. Now, with that, I want to tell you why I think history is important. I think that as you try to go through any program, master's or doctorate, that you need to begin to think about what your professional identity is. And it's easy to do that when you're sitting in a class with other people that are preparing to be what you're preparing to be. It's more difficult to maintain and encourage and promote your own professional identity when you get out in the field and you're surrounded by social workers and psychologists and everybody that kind of wants to make you a second-class citizen rather than a first-class citizen. So I think if you know your history, I think you can have a stronger professional identity because of that. Also, I think you should be proud. I think most counselors, and I think particularly in Ohio, we've come a long way, and I think we should be proud of what we've accomplished, and I think knowing your history helps you be proud. Also, to recognize the contributions of the leaders in your state, and to think about, can you become one of those leaders as part of your future to be a leader for the profession of counseling in Ohio or in another state or in the nation. And also to generate ideas about the future. We were talking prior to coming in here about the need to really kind of figure out where counseling is going in the future. Because we've gotten a lot out of licensure, but now we've got a future that's filled with change and challenges. And what are we going to do? How are we going to continue to promote our profession? And so hopefully knowing something about your history will help you think about ways of generating new ideas for the future. When I say we've come a long way, look at this. When you really think about it, 50 years of school counseling. I do want to say I am going to say some things about school counseling, and I typically, and I know you're all clinical counseling folks, but you can't really understand our history if you don't understand something about where school counseling's come from, because that's really where we all came from. And it's facing a lot of challenges today, may not even survive as we know it. But 50 years of school counseling certification, and now, you know, in the early 2000s, the state of Ohio changed all of what they do in education to licensure. So they no longer call it certification, they call it licensure. It's not licensure like our licensure is, but it is called that. Almost 26 years of counseling licensure in Ohio. Just think about it, almost 26 years of counseling licensure. And to appreciate that in a way, you kind of have to go back 26 years ago and think about what it was like. And I'm sure for many people in here that's not even possible. Because I look at so many young faces and I know it's not possible. But if I had picked up a Sunday paper 27 years ago, I would have seen all kinds of ads for social workers and psychologists. I would have not seen any ad for licensed counselor. And in fact, sometimes in some of the sections of the newspaper, if I saw ads and had a counselor alongside it, it was really talking about one of the women of the night. It was not talking, it was talking about prostitutes. It was not talking about who we think of as counselors. So it was a far different time. And one of the problems we've had, and I think we still have, is counselor. The term is so generic sometimes that it's very difficult to imagine getting a handle or control of a term that is that generic. But all you have to do is to have lived through that time when counselors were really nothing, non-existent. The only kind of counselors that there really were school counselors. And so when you think, and I can, fortunately or unfortunately, I can go back that many years, and because I was living it at that time. I had done my training, and I was living, trying to figure out, why I did this thing, counseling. So you have to work so hard to get ahead in this profession. So we'll talk more about that. 51 years of the Ohio School Counseling Association. 51 years. 40 plus years of the Ohio Counseling Association. So we've been around now longer. We're the new kid on the block when you compare us to psychology and social work. But we still have been around now quite a while. And it's time. In fact, I was saying to David, I think it's past time for us to begin to really examine where we go from here and what the future of counseling will be for you. And you will want to have some sort of conversation, be a part of some sort of conversation about that, I would think, too. Just to give you some quick ideas, this was the Ohio, and I say we, meaning people that are now in the Ohio Counseling Association. We were the Ohio Personnel and Guidance Association back in '67. So we were OPGA. In '84, we became OACD. And now we're the Ohio Counseling Association. Of course, that's the American Counseling Association, the American Association of Counseling and Development, the American Personnel and Guidance Association. But what other organization do you know that's changed its name 3 times in that period of time? And I think that's part of our problem. Not that we changed our name, but we're not totally sure who we are. We're not totally sure what we represent. Human development has always been a major part of what we say we do. Wellness, those kinds of areas. So, what do we do? Do we do clinical counseling, or do we do wellness? Or do we do both? What do we really want our title, our name, our associations to represent us as? So, also, I said if you had any questions, that you should feel free to ask questions. You should also feel free to make comments. So if you have a comment that you want to make, don't hesitate. You don't even have to raise your hand, just make a comment. I'm going to talk for just a little bit about school counseling. And the other thing you have to understand about counseling is if you go back again, let's say 25, 30 years, let's say 30 years, go back again 30 years. Most everybody that was a counselor educator had been a school counselor. That's where they came from. And if you go around the state now and you look at the counselor educators in one institution after another, there's usually an old codger like me that's still around that started out in a school. So that was where everybody kind of started, and that was what they understood. Now they knew they were going different places, but their work experience and their first job was probably in some situation that was school counseling. Some important things have happened, and I'll refer to some dates in here because you kind of have to think about this, or at least I have been thinking about it chronologically. And it helps you understand what's happened to us, I think. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And that was a really important historical event, as well as an important event in our history. Was there anybody in here that was alive when that happened? Okay, a couple people. Those of you, good. Do you remember do you remember some of the, how would you describe the, how we responded as a nation to that? Or and if you were too young to remember that, that's fine, but I mean.
Well, I was just beginning elementary school. I won't say what grade, but, but I remember there was a real sort of a sense of kind of a fear and a challenge to, oh my gosh, the communists are getting ahead of us and what's going to happen.
Nicely put. Nicely put. That's exactly what happened. There was fear. There was a feeling we had lost the race in space. There was a feeling that there was something terribly wrong with this country. What are we going to do? How are we going to change that education system that has totally failed us? And out of that then came a renewed interest in what was happening to students in schools. They aren't getting enough math and science. They aren't getting enough career counseling. There's not enough kids going to college. Some of that sounds real familiar today. But it was at a level that I really don't remember it being worse than it was at that time. I was in college at the time. I remember being very fearful of what this really meant to us. So out of that came the National Defense Education Act. The National Defense Education Act was a piece of federal legislation that provided money for school districts to hire school counselors and for institutions to train new school counselors. So the emphasis here was all, again, on school counseling. In '57, there was some school counseling going on in Ohio. Not a lot, but a little bit. Somebody that had been a teacher might take a couple classes, and then all of a sudden they were counseling in the school, or maybe an administrator that failed as an administrator might take a couple classes, or maybe even better yet, that football coach needed a little more time, didn't want to have to teach social studies, maybe he took a couple counseling classes, and he became the school counselor, okay? So there was some of that going on, and so Ohio had even started to put some minimum standards in place during that time, and saying, it just can't be anybody. You got to meet some sort of standards in order to be a school counselor, and so that was important. In '58, after NDEA was passed, then several institutions in Ohio offered what they called NDEA institutes. And if you went back to all of the counselor educators across the country that are the older counselor educators, they almost all did their doctorate in an NDEA institute, because there were master's level institutes, there were doctoral level institutes, and if they're going to have people coming to college to learn how to be a school counselor, then they better have people that knew how to train them. And there weren't enough counselor educators either. So a very different time than what you find now, because what you find now is the opposite. If we had an OASIS meeting, Ohio Association for Counselor Education and Supervision, last Friday. We had another one in February. If you looked around that group, almost everybody that was there came out of a clinical background. They came from a mental health center. They had a clinical background. They did not have a school background. We're at the exact opposite of the situation that we were in many years ago. Now, many institutions have clinical counselors training school counselors. They don't have school counselors because, you know, the counselor that makes the most money is the school counselor. And so school counselors don't go back and get their doctorate. Why would you leave a job for $80,000, $85,000, $90,000 after you've been there for maybe 15 years, 10, 15 years, 11, 12 years? Why would you go back and get your doctorate so you could make $60,000 a year when when you could stay in school counseling? And that's what's happened in school counseling. Very, very few people have gone back. It's one of the things that happened, and gotten their advanced degrees. And so those people have just kind of disappeared. They've retired, they're gone, they're not out there. OSU had several institutes, Ohio University had institutes, and State University of Toledo. There may have been more, but I've not been able to find any other evidence that other places had institutes. Any of the universities had institutes. The All Ohio Guidance Conference. Some of you go to the All Ohio in the fall. Many of you probably go to the All Ohio in the fall, and we tend to think of it as something relatively new. In reality, it's not. It started in 1957. But then it was called the All Ohio Guidance Conference, because the people that went to the All Ohio Guidance Conference were the school counselors. And that was the way it was for many, many years. It was a guidance conference. It was held at the fairgrounds. They used to hold it at the fairgrounds there in Columbus. People would stay all night, just like they were staying at the fair. And it was quite large. It was quite an interesting group of people. At any rate, that's when a director of pupil personnel, Sam Bonham, who went on to make a name for himself in special ed at the Ohio Department of Ed, started talking about the importance of counseling. He must have come from a counseling program, although I'm not positive of that. In '58, a man named Don Halter chaired a group that then decided they needed a counseling association for school counseling, and that's where the Ohio School Counseling the Ohio School Counseling Association was born. So that long ago, that's a long time ago. Because we were still concerned about the consequences of what had happened with Sputnik, there was even a White House conference on what we needed to do. How could we improve guidance? And a lot of times that's what it was called. Some of you know that some school counselors still refer to themselves as guidance counselors. Guidance counselor. Now, that's where it came from. They were called guidance workers, guidance counselors in the early days. Now, ever since 1990, the American School Counseling Association has asked counselors to call themselves school counselors, not guidance counselors. But, it's only 20 years. Change is difficult. So some people still call themselves guidance counselors. So, at any rate, these are the kinds of recommendations that came out of the whole field at that time, because people were very worried. And I put this in because, well, it was a recommendation, but beyond that, vocational guidance is very important in the history of school and of counseling, period. And it's played a rather strange role in this state, which I'll talk about in just a second. In '63, some very important, in fact, 3 or 4 pieces of important legislation in the early '60s that impact our field. '63, the Community Mental Health Centers Act was passed. This was a mandate that led to the development of better than 2,000 mental health centers, and talked about, providing direct counseling to clients within the community. That was a new concept at that time. Now it's widely accepted, but not then. In '64, were amendments to the NDEA Act that really began to talk about, oh, well, we don't just need counselors in high school, we need counselors in elementary too. And so there was a flurry of activity in the '60s particularly, and occasionally at other points in which elementary counseling was talked about. It has never gotten funding the way it should, and it really has not been a factor in most places across the country. There's some school districts that have it, but by and large, elementary counseling has really never gotten foothold in the schools. In '65, the Elementary and Secondary Act took the place of NDEA. So you'll even see today ESEA legislation. They're talking about now going back and trying to fund or reauthorize ESEA at the national level. In '72, Title IX of the Ed Amendments was passed, which was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act. And this was had some interesting impact because this is the first time that people really began to look at sex bias in tests and assessment. When I was trained at Ohio State, I took the STRONG test, the STRONG Career Interest Inventory, at least 3 different times during my training. It was a strong interest inventory for men. They handed it out, we all took it. It was for men, only norms for men, not norms for anyone else. Finally somebody said, maybe that's not the way it should be. And so things began to change in the whole testing arena, and that is part of the reason why. And we don't necessarily think of Title IX that way. We know Title IX opened up sports for women, but we don't really think about what else it may have opened up for women too. So lots of emphasis on sex bias in tests. If you go back to some of the old journals and read just look at the table of contents and go through, you'll see the kind of articles that were being written. So there was really, in Ohio, some very major and significant interest in what was happening in counseling in schools. And at that time, again, still called guidance and counseling in the schools. A major report came out of the Ohio Department of Ed called Guidance in Ohio, where they had done a study of what school counselors are doing in the schools as opposed to what they should be doing. And one of the conclusions from the report back then was, oh gee, school counselors really aren't doing some of what we would like them to do. Because remember, what people really wanted them to do, or at least what the legislature at the federal level wanted them to do, what Congress at the federal level wanted them to do, was actually get kids more involved in harder and harder subjects and get ready for college, and particularly if they had math and science skills, to go into some sort of scientific careers. So a lot more conferences were being held. It was very typical for the Ohio Department of Ed to hold conferences for school counselors and do everything they could to improve the training of them. In the '60s, a student to counselor ratio, 401. Counselors shouldn't have to have any more than 400 students. Now, they soon do away with that, so that a counselor could have any number. But the Division of Guidance and Testing at the Ohio Department of Ed had 12 people. 12 people. They were busily helping any counselor they could across the country or across the state. People like George Hill at Ohio University was really pushing the notion of elementary counseling. Herman Peters, Tony Riscio at Ohio State were talking about developmental counseling in schools. Let's take kids where they are and move them to the next level. Developmental counseling. So, '67, the National Vocational Education Act was passed. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. In those voc ed amendments, for years to come, clear up until the most recent one, there is money for career counseling. Unfortunately, in Ohio, that money never got spent in career counseling. And I think that's been a major problem, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is what counselors in schools were told to do. These were called the 9 dimensions of counseling. They should develop a written program around these 9 dimensions. They should be working with parents. They should be referring kids to other mental health folks if they needed assistance. They should be counseling students in individual and groups. They should be providing career information for students. This is all the kinds of things that some of you know that school counselors supposedly are to do, or supposed to do. Now that was rather short-lived, probably about 10 years during that time. And unfortunately now we've come to the point where in this last decade, the Ohio School Counseling Association has tried to get the State Department to mandate written school counseling programs in their schools. And they can't, and using the ASCA model, and they can't get the time of day. And one of the reasons they can't get the time of day is there's now nobody at the Ohio Department of Education that has any responsibility for school counseling. Nobody. You can't be called down there and say, I want to talk to someone that's in charge or knows something about school counseling. Nobody. And now, what difference does that make to you? Well, the difference it makes to you as a clinical person is the first counselor that most people interact with are their school counselor. And if their school counselor is no good at all, then their first experience with someone that has that title similar to yours has been a very unpleasant experience. And that's not good. And there's some, there's some reason for that. I mean, there are counselors, let me stop there. Because it's very frustrating if you have any part of your profession, and you must think about your profession holistically. You just can't think about it as, I'm a clinical counselor and I only care about what happens to clinical counselors. You have to think about your profession holistically. At least that's what I'm saying to you. You need to think about your profession holistically. Because really your profession in this state, your clinical counseling came about because there were people from other backgrounds in school counseling that thought about what would be important and necessary for you. And they worked very hard to get something that would work for another group of counselors. You can't cut off part of your body and think that the rest of it's going to be okay. You gotta get the whole show going well. And we don't have the whole show going well. In the 70s, counselor ed programs began to improve their training programs. This is the beginning. ACES began to say, well, maybe we need some accreditation standards or just some standards, because you could have one program training people with just a few hours and they get a school counseling certificate, or you could have another program really requiring a lot to get a school counseling certificate. And so and we've had that problem in counseling as a whole, where we have some programs that have really strict standards and keep increasing the quality of their graduates, and we have others that simply don't attend to that, and that hurts. And so accreditation hurts the profession. Accreditation was being talked about. One of the leaders in accreditation was an Ohio person. Tom Sweeney from Ohio University got interested in accreditation early on in his career and pushed hard for it. Community health, mental health counseling was becoming a specialty now that was beginning to be recognized as something new and something that had some potential to it. A national movement toward licensure of mental health counselors began. Virginia was the first state to pass a licensure law in, I believe it was 76. School counseling expanded, but in Ohio it began to suffer one of its first major obstacles, in that vocational monies that were vocational guidance amendments, vocational education amendments that talked about career counseling, that money in Ohio was siphoned off by the Ohio Department of Ed and sent to the Division of vocational education, which was a part of the Ohio Department of Ed. And that money went to recruit for students to come into the vocational schools. So career counseling dollars were spent for other reasons in Ohio than for the improvement of school counseling, where in some states like Wisconsin, that money went in to continually improve the quality of the school counselors that were operating within that state. And that lasted for better than 20 years. The monies that could have gone and should have gone, our Ohio Department of Ed simply made decisions. The counseling associations were not strong enough to do anything about it. And it's too bad. I think it's really, I believe it really hurt school counseling. Thoughts or comments that anybody has? No questions? In the 80s, the student counselor ratio of 401 was eliminated. I mean, gee, those counselors must just be wasting their time. You can't do more than that. Yeah, so it was gone. Just like that, it's gone. Now that should have been a signal that people were getting a little discouraged. What was it that those school counselors were really doing there? What difference were they making? But it was gone. OASIS. Now, keep in mind too, and this is very important for those of you that maybe want at some point to be a school counselor, and we'll briefly touch upon that later. But you had, in order to be a school counselor in a lot of states in the 70s and 80s, you had to have a background in teaching. You had to be a teacher. And so a lot of people that went into school counseling were people that came from the education ranks. They weren't people that were simply there. You know, that, oh, gee, I want to be a counselor, let me go and get a degree. They were people that came through the ranks of teaching and saw that as kind of what they would do. I mean, if you get tired of being in the classroom, what can you do? Hey, let me get out so I have an office and a desk and I can drink coffee when I want to, you know. So there's lots of reasons for people to do what they do. And they all aren't all altruistic. They all aren't for the best reasons. And sometimes people got into school counseling for reasons that weren't always the best. And some people got in because they were totally devoted to students. That happens in most professions. OASIS, now you keep in mind, I'm talking about the Ohio Association of Counselor Education and Supervision. The counselor educators led a task force to try to increase the education required, because we still had places giving out, having people take 2 or 3 courses. Come in this summer, take 2 or 3 courses, and you can go be a school counselor. So when you've got that kind of training going on, that's not going to lead to the very best and the brightest in the place you want them to be. So the OASIS was always, in fact, it has a reputation of being the group in Ohio that keeps pushing, has kept pushing for more and more education for the training that is needed to be a school counselor. And same thing now with clinical. And when I say, you have to understand, whenever any standards are changed in the state of Ohio and related to education, there's a commission put together that makes recommendations and deals with those changes. That commission is all educators. So there's no diverse voices coming into the conversation. So the same thing happened again and again and again. And so, hey, we don't need 1 year of teaching experience. Let's require 3. No evidence, no research, nothing to suggest that 1 year makes a difference, let alone 3, okay? So you see how it begins to narrow and narrow and narrow the pool of people who would think about themselves as becoming a school counselor. We used to have people come, even into the 90s, into our program, or they'd come to talk about coming into their program at Ohio State, and they would say, I'd like to be a school counselor. And I would always say, now you recognize that you cannot be a school counselor in Ohio without teaching experience. Now we'll be happy to train you here, but you are probably going to have to go to another state in order to actually practice school counseling. And, oh, you're gonna have to be a teacher? I said, yeah, you have to be a teacher. And then it wasn't bad enough that I said you had to be a teacher 1 year. I had to say you had to be a teacher 3 years. And so at that point, their interest in if they were going to stay in Ohio, their interest kind of evaporated, because who wants to become one profession or one kind of professional in order to become another kind of professional? Doesn't make any sense, does it? But it makes sense if a small group of people are controlling your profession, and that's what was happening. Other educators were controlling the profession. So federal counseling money began to disappear during this time too. And it's been very, very slim to none, except in the voc ed. That's why the voc ed amendments and the voc ed money was so important, because that's where money and career counseling was getting some of its stature, but not through NDEA or ESEA anymore. In 1987, we had a national conference on elementary school counseling, elementary middle school counseling, and it was in Columbus, Ohio, and Glasser was the keynote speaker. This is one of the few national conventions. We had an ACES here, didn't we, Lee, a couple of years ago? We had an ACES here, 2 years ago, I think. But we haven't had too many national conferences here in Ohio, but this is one that we did have. And so that happened. In '88, there was a great consternation across the state about what was happening to school counseling. And so Ohio State University took the lead in developing a coalition, and they brought together 27 counselor educators from across Ohio and worked very hard at trying to figure out ways to revitalize school counseling. Developed some materials that had student competencies in them and encouraged counselors to write written guidance programs, whether they needed to or not, whether the state wanted them or not, but to get some sort of curricular approach to school counseling. Put out some, I don't have it handy just now to show you, but put out a brochure to try to, like Ohio's students need school counselors, doing everything they could to kind of revitalize school counseling.
I'm just wondering how that worked. It seems like 22 or 27 people to represent the
27 counselor educators, the trainers, trying to get the trainers to do something as a unit. One of the things that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it. One of the things over the years in Ohio has been that when you wanted to get something done that needed some time to do it, that the professional that has more time to work on an issue is usually a counselor educator. Because if you're a mental health counselor, you can't get out of your job day by day. If you're private practice, you can't really afford to spend too many days away from clients. If you're a school counselor, you can't get out of the school. The professional within our ranks, or the part of the profession within our ranks, that has more, I don't want to call it free time, but they have more time that they can divert. It's the counselor educator. And so lots of the movements have kind of begun or been started or carried through by the counselor educators, because that's kind of the spot that they've been in.
So to ensure, this is a little tangent, but to ensure representation on a project like that, so that it's not just an academic focus,
Yes.
how can we ensure that it trickles down to not just
Yes.
those that are being trained,
Yes.
but those that are already trained?
Yes, we had counselors, we had school counselors, we collaborated with the Ohio School Counseling Association. One of the things we were trying to do was get the Ohio School Counselor Association off its duff. We felt that they were doing nothing, that they'd become kind of a social, pleasant group, but nobody was kicking ass. Nobody was doing a thing. And so that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to get people to say, you know what, this isn't acceptable anymore. What have we grown into? Some kind of fat, lazy, middle-aged people. Let's do something here about our, about our profession. What's happening? So that's, and we did. I mean, you do something like this, and you get a brochure out, and you hold a conference, and which is what we did. I mean, the school counselors kind of woke up. It was like, well, what are they doing? What are they doing? And how can we be a part of that? What should we do? And it resulted in, the consequence of that was that the school counselors did try to get legislation passed that was called 80-20 legislation. 80% of their time would be spent in direct services to kids, and 20% would be in services other than direct services to kids. Because if any of you know anything about school counseling, what you know is what's happened to school counselors is they're doing all kinds of paper and administrative work because their boss is the principal. And that's who is telling them what to do. Many principals do not have the remotest idea of how to use their school counselors or their school psychologists. Until 1987, principals in Ohio had to take one course in how do you use pupil personnel specialists in their schools. In 1987, that course was eliminated. So since 1987, no principals in the state of Ohio have been trained in any way about how to use their pupil personnel specialists in the school. And so many of them use them as assistant principals or do anything that they don't want to have done or that they don't want to do. And so it takes a very strong school counselor to stand up and fight back in those kinds of situations. They are evaluated by their principal. Many of them would tell you they're evaluated on teacher forms. Do a bulletin board well, maintain control in the class. They aren't even evaluated on any job description. Oh, they don't have job descriptions. It's at the whim of the principal. So that's how a profession gets themselves in a really bad, or a part of a profession gets themselves in a really bad situation. So thanks for asking that question. At any rate, I need to move a little faster here, don't I? This is some of what the coalition did. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because I think now we need a coalition to look at the future of counseling again. We need the associations to initiate it. We shouldn't have to. I mean, what are associations for? What are professional associations for, except to look after their profession? They're not social clubs. They're not places where people pad their vitas. They need to be places where people care about what is happening to their profession and start to do something about it. We need that, I think, now. We needed it 10 years ago, but we definitely need it now. We have licensure. We aren't sitting pretty. What's the future hold for us? We need to be thinking about that seriously, not just as I have time kind of thing. So we weren't nearly as successful in this coalition as I hope we would be. We got people fired up. They went down and talked to their legislator about, in fact, we thought we had, I have in many of these artifacts I have a copy of an 80-20 bill that somebody even had the Legislative Service Commission draft for us. And we thought we had the chair of the Education Committee who was going to introduce it. We worked hours and hours trying to get this guy to introduce it. And after he did his appropriate, whatever he had to do to placate, one of the people that was with us was in his district and had given money to him and so on, but not a lot, because he was an educator, not a lot. But they'd given some money to him, and we thought we were going to get him, but he said no, because he believed in local control of the schools. If the principal wanted the counselor to do something else, that was okay. That's what the principal should be able to do it. So schools are a very different milieu in which to work. They're a very different milieu in which to work. So we weren't as successful as we had hoped we would be. But that's one thing that happened, and it's something that we can learn from. We can learn that maybe there's other ways to do it besides, you can do a coalition, you've got to get people to collaborate. That's what a coalition was about, getting people to come together to collaborate and go at it from all different sides. And that's what we were trying to do, although, as I say, we did not achieve what we had hoped to achieve at that particular point. Now we did get some victories later, and we'll talk about that. This is what I said, we mentioned that the coalition had tried to do. We again, I mean, with the one that I had up there just a minute ago, we were again trying to get rid of the teaching experience. Why should she have to be a teacher? Yeah, if she gets trained as a clinical counselor, and someplace down the line here, she decides that she wants to go in and work with kids in the school, why shouldn't she be able to do that? She's a highly trained individual. Why shouldn't any of you that want to work in a school be able to work in a school? Why should some arbitrary thing like teaching experience keep you out of the school? It makes no sense. And there's no research that supports it. So we were thinking about how we could open up our field and begin to pull in to all aspects of counseling, the best people that we could pull in. We were turned down again and again and again by the Ohio Department of Ed. If you want to find an organization, that an entity, an establishment that is old school, ODE is where it is. It is old in their thinking, in their rules, in their regulation, old. Now, over the last several years, they're trying to change, and I hope they can. But it's very hard to reform yourself. And so when it's only educators reforming educators, I'm not sure that, and when it's educators reforming counseling, I'm not sure there's much hope for the kind of change that maybe some of us would like to see. Now, so we had gone twice. I personally had gone twice, and others had too, to testify in front of committees at the Ohio Department of Ed to get rid of the teaching experience. And we would say, hey, look, we'd cite the research, do everything we could to convince them. And it was always a polite, no thank you. Things are going to stay as they are. Or in that one instance, as I told you, it went from 1 to 3 years, kind of like, hey, you know, come back again anytime you want. We'll do what the heck we want. You know, it doesn't make any difference what faction is, we'll do what we want. So in 1998, and I had decided then at that point, no way, it's not going to happen. We are never going to get rid of the teaching experience. In 1998, there was a national movement in school counseling called Transforming School Counseling. And this national movement wanted to change the way counselors were being trained. Because one of the things that's happened, as I said before, now a lot of the counselor educators, and there's several of them here, and you probably want to throw something at me when I'm done, I'm sorry. But this is how I feel, and I was invited to. So I'll take it out on David. But this group says, hey, look, they're training school counselors only to see individual clients. Now, if you've got a caseload, now it's more than 400 to 1. There's no student to counselor ratio, so it could be 1,000 to 1 in some middle schools. You can't carry 35 students a week and not see anybody else. I mean, that's not the way it works. Schools are not going to tolerate that. So they're saying, look, we need people that can teach counselors in internship and practicum to do group counseling, that can go in and do group guidance in a classroom, that understand that they need to work with all their community resources, the mental health centers, the churches, whoever they can get to help them work with kids. They need to be people who can reach out and broker services from the community. So counselor educators, or counselor ed institutions were invited to submit a proposal to the Education Trust, which is a nonprofit group out of Washington, D.C., who believes that a lot of kids are getting shafted in schools, particularly minorities. So we decided that at Ohio State to write a proposal. We wrote a proposal. We were one of the 6 institutions funded, and I wrote in the proposal that we would bring into counseling people who did not have teaching experience. We would somehow get it waived in the state of Ohio. And my colleagues just laughed at me. And then frankly, I kind of laughed at myself. I thought, dummy, you've been this road twice, you failed 2 times. You know, what makes you think you'll win this one? Went to the Ohio Department of Ed, talked to Ed Whitfield at the time, and Ed said, we can't give a waiver to Ohio State. They'll think that you're getting treated as a favorite. It's favoritism if we give a waiver to Ohio State. You've got to get more people than that. So I got Tom Davis from OU. I got Don Bubenzer from Kent State. I got Marty Ritchie from University of Toledo. And I got Bill Nemick from, at that point, he was at Kent State. And we went back to the Ohio Department of Ed. And for the very first time, there looked like there was an opening. So we fought for the next 3 years on this issue, and we got the teaching, we got an alternate, we didn't get the teaching experience waived, we got an alternate path to school counseling that does not require teaching experience. It does not require teaching experience. So it was all that time, and I like to use that example mainly because, see, we started in the early 80s. It became, I mean, it was passed in 2001 and took effect in 2003. But look how long that is to get that change that seemed perfectly rational change. So, so now Ohio is one of the states in which you do not have to have teaching experience. So anyway, third attempt. But one of the key groups was Oasis, and it was a guy that was president of Oasis 1 year and then left the field, Gary Lacey. You may not even know him, but he was great for us because he, you know, he worked with us the whole way, and he happened to be a minority, and it was so helpful to have an African American man go down and testify right along with us. And then there was one student at Ohio State in her late 30s that went to the Ohio Department of, or the Ohio Board of Education meetings and talked about how she had worked at the Environmental Protection Agency in Ohio. She had supervised 37 people. She had had a very successful career there. But she now couldn't be a school counselor because she didn't have teaching experience. And I think the stupidity of that requirement began to be very, very clear to the Ohio Board of Education, and particularly at the same time, they were loosening the standards for people that would be teachers. So the timing was right, and it worked out well. I'm going to shift focus. Well, they did also, and an important thing, they did also recognize KCREC at that time, which they had never recognized KCREC before. That's probably more important to some of us as counselor educators, but I'm going to go past this one a little bit. And what the school counselors have done in the last couple of years that's important is when the Ohio Core was passed, which really ratcheted up graduation requirements, they did get language inserted that said they will strengthen career and educational counseling programs. Now, you know, the state doesn't have any money to do almost anything right now, so that's not happening. Additionally, in 2009, in the Governor Strickland's Ed Reform Plan, a ratio of 1 to 250 was put in the Ed Reform, put in the Governor's Ed Reform Plan, and it was passed. But again, there's no money to really implement some of the reform that the governor did get enacted. So right now, that's nowhere. But if the economy comes back and the state comes back, then maybe there'll be some money for something.
Do you think that if they do enact that 250 to 1 ratio, that you're going to see more school counselors?
You know, I'll tell you what I used to tell my students all the time. One of my responsibilities when I was at Ohio State full-time was to teach career counseling. I love career counseling. Career counseling is one way to reach anybody, and everybody wants career counseling. I mean, the parents love career counseling. That's great for their kids. You know, that's what they want. Get my kid on track. You know, that's what they want. People want career counseling. They need career counseling. Career counseling is a wonderful entree in the door. And you see everything else after you've met with the client for a while. And so I think we've missed the boat in using career sometimes as an entree to other serious problems of kids. But it's very hard to remove stigma. Some of you may remember, wasn't it Symington? Who was the vice presidential candidate that ran on the Democratic ticket years ago, probably 30 years ago?
Shriver?
And he...
Is it Sergeant Shriver?
No, I wasn't Shriver,
Okay.
but I can't, well,
I know who you mean.
anyway, I'm sorry that I apologize for bringing up something I can't recall, but what he, basically what came out as he was running was that he had gone to a psychologist, I think, for depression. And my gosh, how could anybody be qualified to be a candidate for vice president if he had had depression? And so he ended up getting off the ticket after, a period of time. There's a lot of stigma. It's very hard to counteract. But one thing you've got to do first, I think, is you've got to have the best people in your profession you can have. And I don't care where they're going to counsel, they need to be good. And that's one thing we can all do something about. And I think counseling and the credibility of counseling will come if we can do that. So, I'm moving on to mental health counseling because I'm not watching my clock. I'm just kind of praying that I can go fast enough that I can get through this. I mentioned it in the 70s that counselor ed people were beginning to look at their coursework a little differently, and particularly for mental health counseling. The psych people in Ohio, the psych licensure passed in Ohio in 72. And there was a guy in Cleveland who worked in a community college and did assessment on the side. He was a counselor. He got arrested for practicing psychology. And he ended up being acquitted. The judge didn't, the judge's rationale was, listen, I know some lawyers that use psychological principles. So I'm not going to convict a counselor for using psychological principles. And that was a wake-up call. Because that said to people, wait a minute, hey, the psych board went after somebody using some assessment instruments. We need counselor licensure. Maybe we're not safe. And so that's when counselor licensure began to really get looked at as something we needed to do in Ohio. A commission was put together, and the first meeting, these people showed up. Let me tell you, they didn't show up after that. I just love it when I look at some of the old newsletters and they say this happened, and I lived through it, and I think, oh yeah, I think, where did we see them? In the hallway at the first meeting, and then they never came back. So this was something that people wanted to see what was going to happen, and then, those that were really interested stayed. And remember, the Ohio Personnel and Guidance Association is what we think of as OCA today. So OCA put together a group of people who was to study this a little bit, try to figure out. The two people on here that were most important in the long run were Jane Bartlett and Mel Whitmer, because they were people that led the way for the first part of the licensure effort. We introduced the licensure bill 4 times, and during the early days, well, started out with the counselor bill, started out with and the social workers had their own bill. I think it was after the second time the bills were introduced, legislature said, you better both get together because we're not going to have 2 licensure bills. So then, you know, a counselor and social worker bill, or legislation began to be pushed. Now, the social workers wanted to have a practice bill. The counselors wanted a practice bill too, but they would settle for a title bill, meaning that if you called yourself a professional counselor, then you had to be licensed. But you could call yourself a therapist or something else, and you wouldn't have had to be licensed. So title bills are really not worth much. And I think the biggest mistake that ACA, then AACD, then APGA was pushing was the notion that title bills could do anything. One of the things that we're dealing with today in trying to get Medicare recognition at the national level is that we've got so many different requirements in states across the country. You know, you pick up a newsletter a couple of months ago from ACA and they say, California, 50th state to get counselor licensure. What they don't say is some states require this and some states require that. So when you start talking to people nationally about what's required, they aren't sure. In this state it's this, and in that state it's this. Ohio, and this is to me what we did best and have never gotten the credit for because we bucked up against the national on it again and again and again. The national was handing out model bills in the 80s, model legislation, follow this, follow this. Milquetoast definitions of counseling, milquetoast definitions of counseling, and no notion that don't take a title bill, because if you get a title bill and you don't have a practice bill, you can spend the next 20 years getting rid of the title bill and getting a practice bill. So we knew we were going to go with what, as far as we could go with what we had. And it's interesting, as a bill is introduced, a piece of legislation is introduced. This was substitute or Senate Bill 529 or 329. This is about, I think this was the third one that we introduced. And then this was the one that eventually passed. What happens when you piddle with these bills over 3 or 4 times is wording gets changed. And you have to be and then all kinds of amendments, and so you have to read legislation very, very carefully because things can change on you and you may not even realize that it's changed. Well, when we were working on the last version of the bill, which passed in 1984, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but when we were working on that version of the bill, it was clear to me that we had a practice bill. And the social workers who knew, they felt, social workers, there's lots of social workers in Ohio, there were lots of social workers then. Social workers and psychologists have always had very close relationships because in my opinion, frankly, I'm going to say this nicely, the social workers have always been the flunkies of the psychologists. And so they've had very nice relationships all along the way. Counselors do many of the things that psychologists do, and they're more of a direct threat because we were always saying, oh, we can give tests. We can give tests. We know how to give tests. Social workers weren't much interested in giving tests. That wasn't their philosophical bent. So there was a different way of looking at the world from the social worker vantage point and the counselor vantage point. The social workers really didn't pay much attention to us, even though we were part of their bill, and even though we would go to hearings together, because they were getting through with very little opposition. We were getting pillared. I mean, everybody was against us getting licensure. And but as I would read that bill, I'd say, geez, we've got a practice bill. The language just changed. An or was put in the language that hadn't been there before. And we had a practice bill. I knew we did. We finally got through, and in a minute I'll tell you how we confirmed that we had a practice bill. But in the early days, you must realize that people like Mel Whitmer and Jane Bartlett went to hearing after hearing, sat for hours, and there wasn't a lobbyist there. We didn't have the Tanner group like we have now. There wasn't money that people drove. They paid their own gas. If to stay over in a motel, they paid during the motel. Now, we were talking lots and lots of people. We're talking 5, 6 people that carried the water on this pretty much. Charlotte and, well, Jack Cochran from Akron was one that would testify too. But Charlotte and Mel Whitmer kind of petered out. They just got tired. And you can do this for so long, and you just can't keep on doing it. And in 1984, we thought we had great sponsors. We had 2 great sponsors. We thought we had a chance on going to put these guys in. Schwartzwalder and Dean Connie and Michael Schwartzwalder, they were our sponsors. We really felt like we had a chance to get through. They were very hardworking guys, and we were confident that maybe we could make it. And Bill and I were, Bill Nemec from the University of Akron, who is now since retired, and I were working on it literally day and night, at the legislature, sitting there and hearing after hearing. And the psychologists were working so very difficult, and working very hard to make sure we got buried. And they would amend, that's how you do it. You amend the legislation, amend it, till you have nothing left. And the first counselor bill, the first counselor legislation that went through, and that is here, had in it licensed professional counselors with an endorsement. The endorsement to diagnose and treat mental and emotional disorders. Okay? And they would have sent in amendments every time they could to try to change that. The last amendment that they put in, that they were able to get in, was in conference committee. And it was to anyone that would get the endorsement, had any endorsed counselor would have to show that they could enter in, could be accepted by a PhD program. So, okay, you're getting your clinical counseling work now, but you would have to prove to the board that you should be licensed as a clinical counselor by also including a letter of acceptance from a doctoral program to show that you could be accepted into a doctoral program. We did not want that amendment, but we could not get that amendment out. It was either we take the bill with that amendment or we lose the bill. And I have the most vivid memory, David, of Bill Nemec, who's about what, 6'3", 4". Let's see, bigger than me. And Schwartzwalder was coming down the steps to tell us, I can't get this out. And we're in that stage where May, the legislature's going to be gone shortly. We've got to either do it or not. And he's standing there on the steps. Schwartzwalder's here, he's standing here on the steps, and I'm standing here. We have Schwartzwalder, and he's saying, I can't do it, I can't do it. And we're saying, you have to do it, you have to do it. We'll take that amendment, you have to do it. And he went back in, and somehow, I suppose by saying, they'll accept that amendment. We got it through the conference committee, and voted on in the House, voted on in the Senate, and then the governor signed it later. The governor, at the time, and that was another thing that was very important. Republicans theoretically, philosophically, were very much opposed to regulation of the professions by the government. Okay? And the governor at the time was Celeste. The last Democrat that was governor until the one we've got now. And we knew he would sign the bill because we had a friend that knew his sister-in-law. And we kept in communication with the friend that knew the sister-in-law, and we knew he would sign it if we could get it to him. And so we felt we had to get it through then, or we would be in trouble. It was a very different time than it is today. No political action committees were not what they are now. The legislature was run there was an old-time legislator in the state who's really worth 2 or 3 history books, Vern Rife, or he'd be worth 2 or 3 biographies. He really controlled what happened in the state legislatures from the Portsmouth area, Portsmouth, Ohio. That's why there's a Shawnee State down there, because he put it there. There's some politicians, and he was Speaker of the House, and there's some politicians that are just that strong. We knew we had his support too. So we had built key places where we had support, and you know, thank God we got through that particular battle and fight. We were fought bitterly by the Ohio Psychological Association, and we were also fought by the prosecuting attorneys, because the prosecuting attorneys did not want either social workers or counselors to have privileged communication. So when you think about having privileged communication, think about it as some real important thing that people really fought for to get for you, because that was something that, I mean, prosecuting attorneys fought that bitterly for both social workers and counselors. We were saved by a legislator out of Toledo, Mary Jean Valakat. And Mary Jean Valakat, on the floor of the Senate down in Columbus, gave one of the best speeches I've ever heard defending privileged communication. And it really surprised me. Later on, we found that she, in fact, had been seeing a counselor for some drug and alcohol issues, and she apparently knew of what she spoke, because she spoke with such eloquence that she saved the day on privileged communication. So sometimes you get help where you don't know you're going to get help, and you don't know why you got the help. You're just so thankful you got it that you know, you appreciate it to no end. So we were lucky, but we were also tenacious. We couldn't stop. And that's one of the things that I think when you're working on an important issue that will begin to take over. If you know it's important, and if you're committed to it, you find the energy and the strength to keep on going until you have some sort of success at the end. I can still tell you people that voted against it. And for a long time, it was very hard for me to think positively about the Ohio Psych Association. I can tell you that. So I've gone over this and just verbally. So the first board members were Alice Jenkins, a rehab counselor, Bill Nemick, who had worked on the bill with me and was a counselor educator, Jay Matthews, who was a pastoral counselor, and me. I was the first chair of the board, and it just riled social workers no end. They hated it that a counselor was the first chair of the board. They hated it, and I loved it. But you know what? You know what? I didn't advocate for it. I didn't push for it. Remember, I told you that we had a friend who had kept in contact with the sister-in-law. The sister-in-law made it happen. The sister. So see, again, you have no idea what's sometimes going on behind the scenes. It was a beginning for me, just personally, of a very tough decade. When a commission was started, a border commission was started in those days, you had to do it all. We had to find a room, we had to look at state offices and figure out, you know, what we needed. We had to rent space. They gave us a budget. The legislature gave us a budget for 2 file cabinets. 2 file cabinets. The first year during grandparenting, we had 20,000 grandparenting applications. 20,000. October 10th, 1985, at 5 o'clock, people were still sticking their applications underneath the door
Wow.
of the office that we were in. We had them stacked to the ceiling. It took us several years to go through them. And so it was a very interesting time. We had to buy furniture, hire an executive director, the whole 9 yards we had to do, and had a year to do this grant interview. So it was really challenging. We had to write emergency regulations, rules and regulations that were, this was done on my computer because we didn't have a computer. It was done on one of my Macs, one of my first Macs. Because we didn't have computer yet in the office. So it was a very different time. I don't think things would be quite like that nowadays. As I always say these are kind of war stories, but it was just so different than at that time. We bought furniture from the Ohio Penal Industries. 3 of our chairs had broken before the end of the first year. We had these rocking chairs, but everything was cut corners. State government was cut corners, save money, save money. And but we got through it, and it was great. One last comment, because I know this class is over, but two things maybe that I'm very, well, back up, went too far. The practice versus title law. Remember I told you I kept thinking, we had a practice law, and I'd say to Bill, this is practice. But Bill would just say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know, but don't let the social workers know. Because we knew they would start giving us a hassle if they thought in any way we could maybe get the same thing they got. So being the first chair, I was able to take the legislation to the Attorney General and Attorney General's office. There's lots of lawyers in the Attorney General's office. We had one that was assigned to us at the board. And I took the legislation to her and I pointed out the definition. And I said, this seems to me like it's a practice bill. Is that the way you read it? And she said, said, could you put that in writing for us? So we'll have it. And our first opinion from the Attorney General was that we had a practice bill. And that's how close we came to not having a practice bill. And it taught me more than anything. Number one, take a risk. You never know. All they can do is say no. And the other thing is, when you're trying to get through legislation, you've got to watch for what it says. When we wrote, because things change, and sometimes they change for the better. When we wrote the first set of rules, and Bill Nemec and I wrote these rules, when we wrote the first set, we were very, very careful to put language in the administrative rules that clearly suggested that counselors could be giving psychological tests. And later on, when the AG was asked, several years down the line, 96, what was it, 96 I think. I believe it was, let me sure, We did, by the way, try to introduce a third-party payments bill. We introduced the bill in 93, 94, but we couldn't get it out of the House. It passed out of the House Insurance Committee. We couldn't get it out of the House. It's been Republican legislatures for years, and it's very difficult for us to get through Republican legislatures. It just doesn't work for us. And we were fought on that by the Ohio Psychiatry Association and the psychologists. This was 96, I thought it was 96. When we asked in 96, because we were starting to be called by the psych board, we're giving psychological tests. Well, you're trained in assessment, you're trained to give tests. And we've always been, that's not something new in counseling. Now, are we trained to do as many? In the older days, were we trained to do as many as psychologists? Probably no, we were not, honestly. But we knew if we were going to be training clinical counselors, we would be training counselors to give other instruments besides what they had historically given, and that there was no reason they shouldn't give psychological tests, and they shouldn't be able to call them psychological tests. And the Attorney General's opinion there was yes, LPCs and LPCCs could give psychological tests. So could use the term psychological prescribed tests they were trained to do, and if their scope of practice was allowed them to do it, and the scope of practice did. So we have been very, very fortunate in our interactions with the Attorney General. And because we laid groundwork for all of that. Ohio was way ahead. We were the first state that had what was called a two-tier licensure. We had LPCs and we had LPCCs. So we were saying, look, there are counselors that are trained to do career counseling, maybe some marriage and family and other kinds of counseling, but there's also a clinical counselor, and we wrote an administrative rule that said the counselor with the endorsement will be known as the clinical counselor. And that's how that term came about, clinical counselor. And because a board is allowed to write rules to carry out legislation. And that rule writing is an extremely important power that the board has. And that's something that has to be watched, and that's one of the main things that the Counter Policy Group now does, is watch how other boards and commissions and departments are writing their rules. So, and to see whether or not they impact counselors. But as we have worked with licensure, it's no doubt that it has raised the credibility of counselors. It's also given them an opportunity for jobs in places that they never had jobs before. So it's been an important event in our lives here in Ohio. Our two-tiered licensure we were the first to recognize clinical counseling and clinical licensure. And our bill is very strong, and our scope of practice is the same as that as a licensed psychologist in the state. It's very powerful. Many other states across the country do not have what we have, for the simple reason that the National American Counseling Association simply never saw, until very recently, the wisdom of the clinical counseling designation in licensure. And so there's plenty of states that have an LPC who's not necessarily trained to do so, or definitely aren't trained to do some of the things you're trained to do. And so when legislators look at them as compared to, say, the people in our state, there's a big difference in what is required in the training. And we were right, we stuck to it. We were ridiculed in national meetings because we were sticking to it. And, but it was the smartest thing that we could have ever done. It's made our life in Ohio so much easier than it would have been had we not stuck to our guns. So even when the so-called experts think you're wrong, don't give in unless you're sure you're wrong. Because you might be right and they might be wrong. And I saw recently a definition of counseling that's coming out from the National Association, kind of thrown out for discussion. Milquetoast definition again. We must decide who we are, and that's what we must reach for, not try to be something to everybody. So I'm gone over my time. Thank you. I'm sorry.